Good evening all, and welcome. Before the video begins, you need to know that this month I am hosting a mega giveaway. So listen up to hear how it works. There are 8 surprise mystery boxes up for grabs. A new box becomes available every 3 days. And to enter, all that you need to do is leave a little like, drop a comment, and press the bell icon to be subscribed to Mortis Media. However, there is a catch. You have to have left the like and comment on each video that came out in those 3 days in order for your entry to count. Today is day 2 for the 3rd box, so make sure to tune in tomorrow as well for your chance to win. There was also going to be a handful of wicked consolation prizes to those of you who didn't win the box, and will only be eligible for those of you who commented and liked every video in May. Best of luck, everyone. But for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. When I was younger, about 10 years ago, I got into birdwatching. I was about 12, so it wasn't really official by any means. I was just some kid that liked to sneak up on birds, take pictures, and look them up in books. I decided to start this hobby by making a list with pictures I had printed from the library of native birds in my region. Every weekend, I'd wander around the neighborhood, which was suburbs smashed hastily against large plots of land covered in brush, in search of new birds, with a few ponds and a large creek in the area. I found quite a few within my first week. However, there was one bird I had set my sort of white whale, due to its rarity in the area: the black vulture. We had tons of turkey vultures in my area, and most common, but much fewer black vultures. They're a bit hard to tell the difference if they're flying too high. The best was to determine which vulture it is had to do with how much grey or white is on their wings. If they got closer, you can eventually make out the red head of turkey vultures, as I often did, disappointingly. Unfortunately, I cannot remember the exact date, or even what month it was. I believe sometime in the fall. But one weekend, I decided to spend the next 2 days searching high and low for the black vulture. I went climbing over the small wire fence around a nearby brushy area. As per usual, keep out signs be damned. And I searched. Usually, you had the best luck finding scavenger birds on roadkill, beside the road, and there so happened to be a small 2-lane winder that mirrored the creek nearby, just through the foliage. So I cut across the sort of mini forest and headed in that direction. As much as it made me sad to see a dead deer or possum, it was a common sight on this road, as both sides are open, and the trees and undergrowth are almost choking it. There are some parts of the road that almost become a sort of tunnel, due to the leaves and trees intertwining above. It was incredibly easy for a deer, or some other animal, to jump out in front of a car, in the dark, with neither party realizing it until it was far too late. I didn't have much luck. There were a few crows on the smear of a squirrel, and I saw a few ducks swimming the creek beside me. But nothing big. It started getting late, but the sun was still up, and despite the dangers of walking down a forest road in the dark, I was determined to stay out as long as possible. I decided to reach a small park area at the end of the road, and then I'd make my way back. I went under a small tunnel of leaves and came out of the other side, and was delighted to see the familiar shape of a large bird in the sky circling. It was just the right shape and size to be a vulture, but I had no hopes of checking for the greyness of its feathers, as the sunlight was limited. Instead, I was stuck following it as it slowly began to sink lower. After about 10 minutes or so, it landed, and I carefully snuck forward, cautiously avoiding anything that could alert the bird to my presence. I sunk low to the ground, realizing the bird had landed in a small clearing at the far end of a park. It was just a small open field, slightly tilted down a hill, with the parking lot on the top. I had been there before, as it was a fun spot for kids to roll down the hill, because of how steep it was. I approached it from the bottom, excitement brimming, when I heard several squawks and shrieks of other birds. Black vultures are more aggressive than turkeys, and I was hoping to catch a spat. I got to the edge of the clearing and pulled out my binoculars. Two things kind of hit me at once here. One, I found it odd that they were in the middle of the park, rather than closer to the road, when you'd assume they'd find roadkill. Though I reasoned things could die anywhere, even in the middle of a park. However, secondly, it smelt awful. The scent was rather light, but I've been known to have a really sensitive nose, and just this sharp coppery scent, like when you pull rotten ground meat out of a bag. I had smelled roadkill before, and in the heat of the day. It smelled bad, but nothing like this. When I put my binoculars to my eyes, I expected a deer corpse and birds fighting. Never in a million years would I expect to see a corpse of any kind different to that. The birds were there, and I remember the faint pang of excitement. I still had it, and I recognized the proud head of a black vulture, before the image of it sitting on the chest of a naked woman, sucked the life out of me. I was frozen, and I could not look away. My throat tightened with vomit, and I could not look away. The birds had done surprisingly little to her body. She had what I think were cuts, but most of her was intact. What wasn't, the birds were at. Her eyes, lips, and genitals were red and shredded. If there was a big, defining wound, I missed it, between the gathering of birds and the fading light. But what I did see, I can never forget, and I have never forgotten. I can pull up the imagery so clearly now, even after all this time. She was pale, almost blue in places, with blonde, crinkly hair. I sat there stupidly, for who knows how long, as the sun sank behind the trees. This was a time before cell phones were a common thing, and I had quite the hike back home. I realized now that I was in shock, and I could only move when the sudden fear that whoever did this could be nearby and could very well attack me. I forced myself to slowly waddle backwards into the forests, not taking my eyes off the body. I didn't want to turn around for some reason. I was so scared someone would be behind me, and I thought if I backed up forever, maybe nothing would happen. It was dusk, and suddenly there was light, high beams from the top of the hill. A single pair. I heard the screech of tires as the car wheeled out, and listened to it veer off to the left and away down the road, in the opposite direction of where I was heading. That was the last straw, and I ran the entire way back the second I could no longer hear it. I crashed through at least a mile of brush, and while I was smart enough to have boots and thick jeans on, my arms were bare and bleeding by the time I stopped. I paused midway through the brush by my house, realizing that, embarrassingly, I had pissed myself in fear at some point, before nearly crawling my way through people's yards to get home, avoiding all passing cars. The horror didn't completely end there. I was home alone until past midnight, as my mum worked late at a diner nearby. It's stupid, and I regret it to this day, but I didn't call the police instantly, nor did my mum. I was afraid that, if I did, my mum would be angry at me, and that I would never be allowed to go outside again. Or worse, that they wouldn't believe me. I locked all the doors, double-checked, and took a quick shower and locked myself in my room. I had fallen asleep somehow by the time my mum got home. I confronted her in the morning, at least. But by that time, when we made the call together, the body had been already found. They took my statement, and we never got any calls back. I stopped birdwatching after that. I tried my best to find an article or some news somewhere about this, but I failed in finding anything. It probably doesn't help that I can't remember the exact date. I have a lot missing from the ages of 12 to 14, which, for some reason, I can't even begin to explain. There are very few things I remember so well, this being a big one. I have never shared this story with anyone outside my own family, but I thought you might like to hear it. It was almost therapeutic. This happened almost 3 years ago. I had just graduated high school, and a guy from school invited over graduating class to their family's getaway home for a party. I went to a very small school. There were less than 100 students in my class, so it wasn't a big deal for him. Plus, most likely, not everyone in our class was going to go. I'm an average-looking female. I admit there's nothing special about my looks. I'm just a plain Jane. On the other hand, my dear friend Ashley was, and still is, drop-dead gorgeous. This situation was more frightening to her than me, considering she was the one tormented. It was nighttime, and the host's house was incredibly difficult to locate, as well as being a bit far. The GPS on my phone would direct me to weird locations, and I would miss a lot of my turns and forced the GPS to reroute itself. Also, phone service was horrible, so calling for help was almost impossible. It was aggravating, and I almost gave up on going to the party. But I promised my best friend Sarah earlier that I would be there. So I am driving around, and I spot a car parked on the side of the road with its hood up. A middle-aged man literally walks in the middle of my lane and waves with hands in the air to stop me. I slow down to a stop and slightly roll my window down an inch or so, just in case he was dangerous. I am a paranoid person. The man came around to my window and blinded me with his flashlights. I could feel it moving all around my face, and it would move down towards the rest of my body, as if he were inspecting me. I asked him kindly not to shine the flashlight in my face, because I could not see. He apologized and said that his friend was supposed to be stopping by to help him with his car, and thought I was her. I was convinced he was telling the truth. His voice sounded friendly and honest. Since I was there, I told him I needed help with directions, and he seemed more than happy to help. I thanked him and went on my way. I finally made it to the road I was supposed to be on, and was confident I would make it to the house soon. Then I received an incoming call from Ashley, so I picked up. It was hard to understand her at times because of the bad reception, but I understood that she was lost and needed help with directions. I pull over on the side of the road, hoping to keep the little reception I had to help guide her. All the street names she told me were unfamiliar, and the ones I had told her were unfamiliar to her. I assured her I was on the right path, because I was on the one road I wrote down for the address earlier at home, and I asked her to backtrack her steps and tell me all the roads she turned on. She began telling me the names of the roads, and I recognized them until she started mentioning the directions she said that she got from a man on the side of the road. I told her that I got directions from the same man, but the directions he gave me were not the ones that he gave her. I was confused. In fact, I was the complete opposite way. I told her not to worry. I would drive back to find her, and then she could follow me the rest of the way. She was satisfied with the plan, gave me the directions, and we hung up our call. So I made my way all the way back to the turn the man had told Ashley, and followed the directions from there. The road was creepy and very dark. It was long and surrounded by a bunch of trees, and it felt like it was leading me further and further into nowhere. I tried calling Ashley, but I no longer had service of any kind. Before we hung up, I had her pull up over somewhere until I found her. I drove a little more and was relieved to see back lights up ahead, knowing that it was Ashley's car. As I got closer, I noticed that there were people surrounding the car, and I mean a lot of people, maybe 7. There was also a truck parked diagonally in front of her, as if it were blocking her from moving forward. I thought that was strange. I wasn't too worried, until I realized what those people were doing. They were banging on her car and trying to get inside. One of them even had a bat, and I could tell that they were all male. I quickly began to panic. I was frightened for my friend and had no idea how I could help. I couldn't call the police because of the damn bad reception, and I was only one person. What could I do to stop a group of men? I finally came up with the only solution I could think of. I was going to run them over. That was literally the only thing I could think to do at that moment. I was terrified to do it, but I knew I had to do something. After all, they were in the wrong. I stepped on my gas pedal so hard that I began speeding towards them, honking my horns along the way. My heart was pounding so hard. They noticed me, and without hesitating, they scattered like little scared animals. A few hurried into the trees, while the others fled into the truck and sped off. I came to a halt next to Ashley's car and let her know that it was me, and she then followed me closely behind as we made it back to town and parked in a safe location. I hugged her so hard. Her cheeks were drenched in tears, and her body was shaking uncontrollably. I have never seen anyone so terrified in their life. We called the police right away, and they came to where we were. Ashley and I told them of what happened, and a few cops searched for the men. Here's what Ashley said. The man on the side of the road did the exact same thing he did to me, except instead of sending her in the correct direction, he sent her in another, which coincidentally led her to a group of men who terrorized her. The truck drove down to where she was parked, blocked the front of her car, and there were men inside the car and outside in the back. They all jumped out and began yelling at her to get out. They became angry when she wouldn't listen to them and began beating her car, trying to force her out. They threatened to break her windows if she continued to disobey. She tried driving away, but the men kept blocking her way, and she didn't have the courage to hit them with the car. They were yelling sexual comments and other profanities at her. They did all of this until they noticed my arrival and fled. We didn't see the license plate number, and to be honest, I wasn't even thinking about it. I was more concerned with Ashley's safety. I wish I had gotten it, because the cops said that they searched the area and also the way the car had driven, and found no trace of the men. They assured us they would let us know if they caught them, and then we could focus on what to do from there. A few weeks go by, and I had my mum call in to check on their progress, and they still had no success in locating them. I was really upset and frustrated for a while, and Ashley was very scared to leave her house for a long time. Her parents even suggested she see a therapist, but she refused. Since then, she's moved on from it and is happy. However, she and I will never forget that scary experience. It was truly horrifying. This happened when I was in college. I lived in Isla Vista, the student community at UCSB, notorious for being a party school. It fully lived up to its reputation. I like to party, but holy shit, these people were off the wall. As such, there were a lot of people who put themselves in dangerous situations, drinking to excess, not being careful, not locking doors. It had a very isolated and insular vibe, and anyone who was hanging out, who wasn't college-aged, immediately looked out of place and strange. One night, after having a few drinks, I came home to my small house where I lived with 2 other girls, probably around 2:30 a.m. We were all serious students. I was probably the least serious, actually. And when we partied, it was not your typical UCSB mega rager, more like a small get-together with friends. We would often have few people spend the night, sleep on our furniture, or in our beds, as may be the case. That night, my roommate had a few people over, who I didn't know. And I saw them when I returned home. One of them had opted to sleep on the couch from the shadow that I saw there. I didn't turn the light on, so I wouldn't wake anyone up. But as I was passing the couch to enter my bedroom, I noticed that the figure was lying very stiff. He just had this weird energy. He was lying down, but it was like he was putting all of his energy into being as rigid and still as possible. I paused, and the guy quickly jerked his head to face me, without moving his limbs, so quickly that it actually startled me. I could see his wide-open eyes glinting in the dark. Figuring that I'd startled him, or that maybe he was drunk or on some kind of stimulant and unable to sleep, I just hurried past him into my bedroom, locked the door, and that was it. The dude made me nervous, and I wasn't taking any chances, and I fell asleep. At 4:30 a.m., I woke up. There was a strange sound at the door, almost like someone was drumming their fingers on the wood very quietly. I lay still and listened. There were more quiet sounds, like something scratching the door with their finger, which got louder and louder until it was clear that he was using both hands and scratching as fast as he possibly could. It created an extremely loud and intimidating sound that filled me with fear. I got my cell phone and texted my roommate because I was afraid to make a sound. "Your friend is freaking me out. Is he coked out? Can you talk to him? He's banging and scratching on my door." She didn't text back, probably because she was asleep. I texted my other roommates to the same effect, covering all of my bases, keeping in mind the scratching had been going on at this point for a couple of minutes. I have no idea how he could have sustained it. Scratching a wooden door with your fingernail can't feel good. He also grabbed the knob and jiggled it super forcefully, but neither of them answered. I decided to call and really wake them up, though I was scared to make a sound. I know it sounds stupid, but there was something seriously horrifying about being teased like this through the door. I knew that he was trying to scare me. I felt like a little kid, but I could tell this guy was messed up, or something, and maybe the police needed to be called. And I wanted to loop my roommates in on it, since I was one of their friends. The scratching stopped abruptly, and I called my roommate, who answered sleepily. "Yo, your friend is messed up. Can you please deal with it? Do we need to call the cops? He's seriously scaring me. He was scratching at my bedroom door. Really weird." She didn't say anything for several seconds, and when she did speak, her voice had no sleepiness in it at all. "What friend?" she said. "The guy who was asleep on the couch," I said. She was all quiet again. "We didn't have any guys over." "Call the police." My adrenaline surged, and I told her to please lock the bedroom door as quickly as possible. I realized that I hadn't heard scratching in a while, and I had no clue where the dude had gone. Suddenly, I heard a loud banging in the other end of the house, where my roommates Lauren and Monica shared a bedroom. The bangs were followed by the sound of them screaming in fear. I quickly dialed the police as this maniac proceeded to bang against the, luckily, locked bedroom door of my two roommates as they screamed. The heaviness of the blows left no doubt that he was trying to break the door down. I told the 911 operator the situation, and she dispatched 2 squad cars. The police in Isla Vista are generally used to peeling drunks off the sidewalk and breaking up brawling frat bros. This was really serious and strange, and I think the dispatcher got the sense from my tone of how terrified I was. And she stayed on the phone with me. At one point the banging stopped, and everything was quiet for a while. I talked with the dispatcher, and suddenly looked down to see that this guy had slipped his finger through the 1-inch gap between my door and the floor, and was kind of wiggling them around, making this weird growling sound. I screamed and backed away. This was my biggest regret about this situation, since when I looked back, it would have been so awesome to just stomp the shit out of those fingers and hear the guy growl and howl in pain. That's when the cops rolled up. I heard running and the sound of our sliding glass door open and close, and then he was gone. The cops never caught him. He had broken in through our side door by jimmying the lock somehow. My door was covered in what turned out to be huge gauges that he made with scissors, which he discarded on the ground before he left. What terrifies me the most about all this is that I walked right past him. I looked at him right in the face. I realized now that he was not trying to sleep nor on drugs, but was lying stiff because he was hiding. He probably heard me open the door and freaked out because he probably hadn't realized that there was another girl living there and tried to blend in with the couch in the darkness. Around 2 years ago, I finally moved into a brand new house in a brand new building estate in Australia. I was one of the first to have a finished build in the area and was elated to finally gain independence. The first few weeks went by as normal, and during that time, I'd often take walks alone with the dog in the afternoons and roam the surrounding estate area. All the roads around us had been partially completed, and all the other properties were marked out. But no other houses were built, excluding one that was directly opposite mine. The house looked finished, but there was no driveway laid yet, and from what I could gather, nobody lived there. To the left of my house, roughly a few 100 meters away, was a field with a huge hill in it. I later found out that the whole area was council property. Not only was no one allowed to build up there, but the whole hill was basically a no-go zone, for whatever reason, and the council just didn't want people on it, so the whole area was surrounded by a huge chain link fence. The only other noticeable feature in the area was a small abandoned farmhouse with a shed a few kilometers down the road. I knew nothing about it and often went walking there with the dog, as it gave me something mild to explore amongst the vast nothingness I was living around. The entire place was dilapidated and completely uninhabitable, but it was still interesting nonetheless. About a month or two after moving in, I awoke one morning to the sound of a violin. It sounded extremely distant and quite haunting. I actually enjoyed it and assumed that the neighbours opposite me had finally moved in. Excited that I finally had some people to talk to, I peeked out of the curtain and saw the house opposite mine was still as vacant as ever. I got dressed, but by the time I managed to look outside, the violin had stopped. This happened roughly every second day for the next week. The violin could wake me up and then just disappear about 45 seconds later. I'd ignored it to the point where my curiosity simply got the better of me, and the next morning when I heard the violin playing again, I immediately jumped out of bed, threw on my dressing gown, and shot out the front door. I scoured the early morning, standing out there, and looking on the hill, there was a figure playing a violin. It was barely light out, and I could see the person from the distance as they were playing. They were doing what can only be described as a waltz-type walk, spinning slowly around in a circle as they played. I took my eyes off the person and walked over to pick up the morning paper, and in 10 seconds, I heard the violin stop. When I looked, the figure was no longer playing nor dancing, but was now standing still and looking in my direction. It was so dark that I could barely make it out, and we both stood there for half a minute, not moving, not doing a thing. The creeps then got the better of me, and I went back inside. After that morning, things started happening. On my walks, I began to notice footprints on the surrounding properties that weren't made by me, that I'd never seen before, which I just assumed were from the people walking up the other houses in the area. I never awoke to the violin, but I swore I could hear someone walking the streets next to my bedroom, in the early morning especially. However, I never saw anything. Other really general things happened as well, like little random tools, such as spades and rakes, laying around the area, which I guess were left by construction crew, none of which I ever saw. I started getting calls at work that would immediately hang up on me, and I also stopped walking up to the abandoned farmhouse, as the experience with the violin player had me a little shaken up. One night, as I was heading off to bed, I turned off the television in the living room, and again could hear the faint sound of a violin playing. However, it sounded more muffled and rehearsed. I froze, and a cold chill flowed through me instantaneously. Considering that it was about midnight, and not the usual time I'd hear it playing, I went to the front window and peeked out to see that there was a light in the house opposite mine. It was clearly a candle, as I could see the dim light flicker in the empty window, and the music sounded like it was coming out of an old record player. But in the 10 minutes I watched, I never saw any movement inside the house. I moved away from the window, sufficiently freaked out, and after another 5 minutes, I heard the music abruptly stop. I peeked out again and noticed the light was now on. I never saw anyone. I began to become unsettled in the house, and would often invite friends to hang out until late. But of course, nothing would ever happen when someone else was with me. I never bothered to tell any of my friends, as without evidence, I figured that they would just give me shit about it, and I'd just become more agitated. But nothing compared to what happened next. In my living area, the desk sits right next to a small window, which looks out to the fence surrounding my property. The steel fence is literally an arm's length from the house, and about 6 feet tall, so I always figured that unlike most other windows, I'd never need to cover this one with a sheet or blanket, because no one could ever see in. I usually had headphones on when I played, and I always had the light off for no other reason than I preferred to play games in the dark. One night, when I was gaming, I got up and walked into the dark kitchen and got a beer out of the fridge. It was dead silent, excluding the faint sound coming out of my headphones. As I turned around to face the desk, I saw directly out the window 2 very faint lights. I didn't even catch on, and immediately started walking back to the desk, fixated on the small glowing balls. And it wasn't until I had my nose almost pressed against the glass that I realized the 2 lights weren't lights at all. They were eyes. A set of eyes, sitting just above the fence line, staring wide open at me. They didn't blink, they didn't move. My entire body locked up. All I could do was simply stare back, as my brain was still comprehending that there was an actual person looking at me in the scariest way I could possibly ever imagine. I don't know what happened. Either my head kicked into gear, or my muscles loosened my body, and it automatically collapsed, and I fell to the floor, scurrying to hide against the wall away from the window. I could hear my heart beating through the carpet like a drum as I tried to lay as flat as possible, as my mind was still processing the sheer severity of the situation. And then a violin started playing. That goddamn violin. And the haunting tune it always emitted started up. Except this time, it was directly outside my window, and much louder than I'd ever heard it before. The lights were still off, and I wanted to get up and turn off the PC screen, so I couldn't be seen. But my whole body just wasn't ready to cooperate. Not only was the sound of the instrument extraordinarily loud, but it sounded like it was being played with frustration, notes being missed frequently, and the strings screeching. The pace of it was getting faster and faster, and by this time my dog Jeb, out in the yard, had picked up on the situation and registered an unfamiliar sound and gave one solitary, deep bark. The violin instantly stopped, and the house was finally dead silent, excluding my headphones, which I could hear quietly working away. I was still frozen to my carpet, and it wasn't until Jeb gave a second menacing bark that I heard the figure outside the window start to walk away in the direction of my yard. Once that first footstep hit the ground, I instantly thought of the welfare of my best mate, and finally, my head connected with my extremities, and my entire body kicked into overdrive. I left the ground and slid across the laminated floor to the back door, where Jeb was standing, staring into the backyard. I ducked to keep low and quietly unlocked and slid open the door. Usually, doing so would notify Jeb that he was allowed inside. But when the door opened up, he didn't move an inch and was completely fixated on the pitch black yard. Everything told me not to go outside, but there was no chance I was letting anything happen to my dog, and I moved out onto the al fresco, moved behind Jeb, put my hands under his collar, and attempted to back him towards the house. Jeb is a pure Labrador and weighs like a sack of sand, so when he doesn't want to move, he isn't going to move. It takes a sheer force to pull him in the direction that you want him to go, and right now, Jeb wasn't going anywhere. I yanked his scruff, and as I did, he emitted a bark like I'd never heard before. A deep, bellowing, piss right off kind of bark. Sound that elevated my nerves to an all-time high. We both just stood there, waiting for some form of reply, and I couldn't remember how long we both just froze there. But eventually, I heard footsteps from around the side of the house begin to walk away. It was not a simple walk, almost like whoever was doing it was slowly dancing in a circle. The footsteps keeping to a beat as they drifted away the house into a distance. Once I couldn't hear anything, Jeb licked his lips, gave me a look, and wandered back inside. I followed, locked the door behind me, and spent the night reverting to my childlike self, hiding under my bed covers with my dog, and I didn't sleep a wink. That was the last time I ever saw or heard the violin player. The following morning, when the sun finally came up, I called into work sick and called the police. They thoroughly searched the lot next to mine and found footprints in the dirt. However, there were so many that it was impossible to tell whose were whose. The only description that I could give the officers was his height. He would have had to have been at least 6 feet to stare over the fence at me. But they explained that he could have been standing on something or on his toes. They also told me that they've never received a report of anyone playing a violin in the area or anyone being in the fenced-off hill either. I essentially looked like an insane person, but the officers were very nice about the whole thing and offered to patrol the area for the next few nights, which helped put my mind at ease. Nothing else had happened since. Over the next 2 years, people finally started moving in, and I tell them all the story about the figure I saw, some of which still use it to keep their children in line, which I found funny. One guy nicknamed the council lot Violin Hill, and the name has stuck around our street since then. I even spent a period of time scouring the depths of the internet for that violin tune I kept hearing, but I could never find it. There are a few classical pieces that seemed reminiscent, but I've since thought that whatever tune that was played must have been self-composed, which creeps me out even more. I'm still in the house, and I still tell people the story, and I haven't changed my routine one bit, which has really helped me block out the fear of the experience. Except for one thing. I now game with the blinds closed. I have always had an innate fear of the night. Not so much the dark, but the night itself. As a child, my imagination was overcome with stories of creatures that came alive at night, and the safety offered by a house and light. I never had anything to base this fear on, until a night when I decided to go with a buddy of mine to a baseball game and got stuck at a light after 2 a.m. Right after I left him at his house. Of course, that night the game went into extra innings, and so I didn't get a chance to drop my friend off back home until well after 1 a.m. Everything was fine on the way home until I hit a light right before the street that led me to my house. It was a T-junction, and I was turning left. The light is one of those that you think is broken until it finally turns green, when you finally decide to just run it. Of course, I pulled up right as the light turned red. I would have just run the light, seeing as there was no one there and it was close to 2 a.m. after all, and a school night. But earlier that week, I had heard the phrase, "Character is what you do when no one's looking." And for whatever reason, that was the night I decided to prove to myself that I was a man of character. I pulled to a stop at the light, feeling good about myself, bordering on self-righteous, when I happened to look out my window, to my left, and noticed a lady sitting all alone on a bus bench. We made brief eye contact, and I quickly looked away. It was getting late, and I could see movement out of my peripheral vision, and knew that she was coming my way. I looked out the window and noticed that she was carrying a bag. I quickly checked that my doors were locked and all my windows were up. I then moved my right foot above the accelerator, just in case, and braced myself for what was about to come. I was hoping that it would just be an awkward exchange, and was praying for a quick light change before she reached me, so I could just get out of there. I knew there was a slim chance of that. She walked right up to my window, put her bag down, and began to tap on my window. I nervously looked up at her as she motioned for me to put my window down. I had automatic windows, so I just imagined pushing too hard on the window button, and the thing came down all the way. I took a deep breath and lightly flicked it with my finger, and the window moved microscopically down. But she did not seem to notice or care. She then leaned in and began to talk. She said the following: "My boyfriend beat me up. I have a friend who lives down the street. Can you give me a ride?" I should stop and give you a brief description of the bag lady. She was small and skinny, and of indeterminate age. She was either in her mid-20s and had lived hard all those years on the street, or she was a 60-something-year-old woman who had lived a moderately hard life on the street. All that to say, just by looking at her, there was no way to verify her story. She looked beat up by life, not just by a boyfriend. But there was something about her delivery. It was robotic and seemed practiced, and like she was disconnected from the moment. That made my skin crawl, and after a brief second, debated on whether or not I should do it. I told her that I had to get home and could not give her a ride. After my first refusal, she leaned in closer and said the same thing again. My boyfriend beat me up. I have a friend who lives down the street. Can you give me a ride? This time I felt more confident when I declined her and told her I had a curfew and needed to get home. She leaned in a third time and began her statement again. My boyfriend beat me. At this point the light changed. I slowly lifted my foot off the brake and started slowly rolling forward and began uttering an apology. She didn't move. She just looked at the light and looked down at me, leaned in closer, and said 5 words that have haunted me ever since. You made the right decision. She then picked up her bag and walked back towards the bench. I peeled out of the intersection and cried and screamed all the way home. I have no idea what she planned to do, or if there were other people waiting to jump in the car from the bushes had I moved to let her in. But that encounter has haunted me since and has confirmed in my mind that nothing good happens after dark. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I am feeling really left behind with the times. I feel like everyone has seen Infinity War Part 1 except me and my wife. Hopefully my wife and I will manage to find the time to watch it soon enough. And please, don't drop spoilers in the comments section. I've tried really hard to potentially avoid tainting the experience by pretty much avoiding a lot of YouTube channels, all news, and yeah, a whole lot of stuff. Hopefully this week, but have to wait and see, I guess. Make sure that you don't forget to drop that like and leave a comment to get your entry into the competition, and to hit the subscribe button and the little bell icon to be up to date with everything I post. Today was the second day for your chance to win the 3rd mystery box. Best of luck. If you would like me to read your story on my channel, feel free to send it to my email or share it to my Reddit, which you can obviously find in the description. Now, you've come to the end of the video, and no doubt you want to listen to something else. Whoa now, no need to go anywhere else. I have you covered. I've left some wicked links on screen for you to have a gander at and hopefully find something new, which you'll probably enjoy. But anyway guys, for now it is time for me to sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one. All the roads around us had been partially